welcome to this year's Global Sustainability Symposium, focusing on water and energy at a crossroads. My name is Erica Edwards, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for European Studies. And before introducing our keynote speaker this evening, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the initiative. So the symposium is part of a four-part series focusing on global sustainability that brings together local and global experts to explore key issues. Previous symposia have focused on micro-franchising in the emerging markets, and on the global food chain. I think many of you might have joined us for those previous symposia. The goal of the symposium is to bring together a diverse groups, and I think looking at the group out here, I see diverse groups. So faculty, students, business and civic leaders, interested citizens, right? With the aim of increasing understanding of issues important to human and ecological peace, health, and well-being. We also want to present solutions, right, by presenting best practices, to stimulate productive discussion, and to enrich the network of those interested and informed about climate change and about war. Now, definitely there are a lot of different units on campus involved in making this symposium happen, and so I want to take a little bit of time to acknowledge the co-organizers and co-sponsors. So we have the Keenan-Flagler Business School Center for Sustainable Enterprise, and we have the Center for International Business Education and Research, better known as CYBER. As you know, we'll be spending day 2 of the symposium over at the Business School at the Keenan Center. Other groups that are involved are several of the area studies units here on campus. So the Center for European Studies, the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies, the African Studies Center, and the UNC Institute for the Environment. I also want to take a moment to thank the Department of Education and the European Union for funding this event, as well as the UNC College of Arts and Sciences and the Provost's Office. And a special thanks to Bull's Head for being here and facilitating our book signing before and after Christian's talk. Well, we're very pleased to have with us tonight Christian Parenti. And Christian is a professor of sustainable development at the School of International Training Graduate Institute. He is also a visiting scholar at CUNY Grad Center and a contributing editor to The Nation. He is the author of 4 books, the most recent being The Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change, and the New Geography of Violence, which he'll be discussing with us here tonight. As a journalist, Christian has reported extensively from Afghanistan, Iraq, various parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. His articles have been featured in Fortune, The Washington Post, The New York Times, the London Review of Books, and Mother Jones. Christian holds a PhD in sociology and geography from the London School of Economics. He has had several fellowships, including one from OSI, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the Ford Foundation. In addition, Christian has received several awards, including the 2009 Lang Taylor Prize and the Best Magazine Writing 2008, awarded from the Society of Professional Journalists. Christian's 3 previous books include The Freedom, Shadows and Hallucinations in Occupied Iraq, The Soft Cage, Surveillance in America from Slavery to the War on Terror, and Lockdown America, Police and Prisons in the Age of Crisis. And now I'll turn it to Christian.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks to everybody who put this on. I've been involved in similar types of things, and I know it's a lot of work to put on events like this. So what I'm dealing with more microphones, which brings me to one of my pet peeves, actually, which is technology. You'll notice I'm not using any PowerPoint tonight, which is pretty much common that you're supposed to use PowerPoint everywhere you go. Not using PowerPoint started as laziness on my part and has hardened into a kind of ideological position. It became an ideological position after I was at a really great environmental geography conference, and every single paper had PowerPoint, and it got to the point where people were stepping aside and just sort of describing their slides and submitting to the PowerPoint rather than having the PowerPoint be their tool. So I apologize if you're used to images tonight. It'll just be words. So my book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, was born out of two long-standing concerns of mine, one about violence and states and war and repression and policing, and also the environmental crisis that has been ongoing for my whole lifetime. I just wrote a piece on the 40th anniversary of The Limits to Growth, which is the most popular environmental book ever published in, I think, 13 languages, 30-something languages, I don't know, enormous number of copies sold. And I actually found it on the street when I was 18, walking along, and that is what started my concern with the environment. And most of my scholarly work in journalism has not really focused on the environment, but I did write some articles along the way, and I've always been concerned about the environment. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've brought together my concern with energy and the environmental crisis with discussions of violence and the nature of the state. So this project began actually in Afghanistan when I was reporting on the poppy trade. And I did a series of stories separated by a couple of years on the poppy trade. And from poppy comes opium and heroin. And Afghanistan is the main producer of heroin in the world. And I would interview farmers in different parts of Afghanistan and at different times and ask them why were they growing this crop, which involved some risk to them because the Karzai government and the NATO forces supporting it have made poppy eradication at least an official part of their program. In reality, often there isn't that much eradication because of corruption on the ground. But nonetheless, whether one's crops are actually eradicated or not, because of eradication, farmers take a risk. You either lose your crop or you get shaken down by the police who come to eradicate your crop. So there's risk involved in this. So I asked, trying to figure out why this illegal crop was proliferating during the war, proliferating under the occupation. And one answer that I always got, which at first I didn't quite understand, was that poppy is very drought resistant. They would list all sorts of various things and then argue, well, why is it legal for your government to tax alcohol and we're not allowed to grow poppy? And then say, well, and also, it's drought resistant. And I didn't even realize there was a drought in Afghanistan. Well, it turns out poppy uses 1/6 the amount of water of wheat. And it has a, similarly drought resistant vis-a-vis grapes and apricots and the other traditional crops in Afghanistan. And not only is Afghanistan in a drought, Afghanistan is going through the worst drought in living memory, which has coincided with pretty much the entire NATO occupation there. So what that means is that under the current environmental conditions, poppy, which uses 1/6 the amount of water that wheat and generally the same amount as other crops that are being pushed by USAID and DFID and whoever is part of their alternative livelihood schemes. Under these environmental conditions, this is the only crop that farmers can grow and actually make money on because you simply can't grow wheat. Never mind what the prices are, you're just not going to be able to grow enough of it to survive. So this is not to reduce the war in Afghanistan to poppy, and in the war, there are two sides with two positions on poppy. The government and the Karzai regime, as I said, oppose poppy. The Taliban, on the other hand, support the farmers' right to grow poppy, and they offer protection to the farmers who grow poppy, and they make this part of their recruiting rhetoric. And so you can imagine how, along with all of the religious and ethnic motivations a young Pashtun farmer in southern or eastern Afghanistan might have for supporting the Taliban against these non-believing invaders wandering around their country. There's also an economic reason, which is that that's the side in the conflict which is going to defend your family's right and ability to grow the only crop that under these conditions, these climatic conditions, is economically feasible. So it's not to reduce the conflict to that, but while reporting and reflecting on these stories, I realized, okay, there's actually a climatological element to this war in Afghanistan. It wasn't caused by climate change. It's not the main driver of the war by any means, but it's an element. It's part of what explains why the Taliban have an endless line of recruits to support them. And a civilian infrastructure to care for their wounded and hide their weapons, etc. So I thought, well, if I look around, I wonder how many other conflicts involve climatological aspects. And just a caveat to begin here. It is difficult or impossible to ascribe any one regional climatologically driven crisis to climate change, or any weather event like the storm that's arriving in the East Coast now, to ascribe it or some of its intensity to climate change, though increasingly there are some climate scientists who are willing to try and say that a certain percentage of the intensity of these extreme weather events like the drought in the Midwest here, or these extreme storms like Sandy and this one, Noah or Nemo, whatever they've named it, that there's a certain percentage they're willing to say this is caused by climate change. But leaving that aside, say we cannot ascribe specific events to climate change. But what is clear is that climate scientists have for at least 30 years, and using more than 14 increasingly sophisticated computer models, been predicting a general pattern. And these events fit that pattern. Increased drought and desertification in many places, including in Central Asia and Afghanistan. And interestingly, in many of the places I discuss in this book, and many of the places where you see increased drought and creeping desertification, you also actually see rising rates of precipitation, rising levels of precipitation. More rain, more snow. It's just that the water is coming at the wrong time and all at once. So the floods in Pakistan, certain parts of northeast Pakistan near the Afghan border in Afghanistan was also hit in the 2010 floods. Those were the worst of the floods. There had been bad floods the year before, 2010, and floods in 2011 as well. And parts of northeast Pakistan got more than a year's rain in a week. So I began my research by going to the Horn of Africa to explore what was going on, and moved from there through Central Asia and into Latin America. And I'll tell you sort of the specifics of these different regions and how they play out, and how climate change is already a driver of violence in these places. But what I found overall was that climate change rarely appears in the politics of violence in a clearly legible form. You have to interpret to some extent. In other words, it usually works through pre-existing crises, and it acts to exacerbate pre-existing crises. And all across the global south, generally it exacerbates two pre-existing crises, which are the legacy of Cold War militarism and the proxy wars that were part of that, the hot proxy wars that were part of the Cold War, and the legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring, which has led to weakened states and increasingly unequal economic arrangements in much of the global south. And even when neoliberal economic restructuring, that is to say, the economic theory of removing the state from the market, privatizing state assets, deregulating markets, opening national economies to foreign trade and investment, even when those kinds of policies are associated with high rates of growth, as they are currently in India, they are also associated with increased inequality. And this is, as sociologists have long known, destabilizing. Violence of various types, be it criminal violence, class violence, religious violence, ethnic violence, is often fueled not by absolute suffering and immiseration, but by relative deprivation, by experiencing your suffering as unjust and unfair in relationship to what used to be, what someone else has, what some ideology tells you could be. And so even in the successful cases where liberalizing market economies leads to high rates of growth, which is its whole stated goal, you see increased inequality. And so that is destabilizing. But the fact of the matter, the real track record of neoliberal economic restructuring is often that it has produced very low rates of growth. That was the case in Latin America throughout the 1980s and in the early 1990s, when most Latin American economies were going through neoliberal economic structural adjustment at the behest primarily of the World Bank and the IMF. And there you had increased inequality, but you didn't have high rates of growth. The legacy of Cold War militarism, more specifically, is that it has littered much of the global South with cheap weapons and unemployed men trained to use those weapons and trained in the arts of irregular warfare. Unemployed men with access to cheap weapons who know how to ambush and kidnap and hijack and fight in small units. So when the Cold War ended and the great ideological divide disappeared, and in many ways the motivation for the hot proxy wars in the global South evaporated, peace did not necessarily come to many of these regions because there remained people with guns and problems. And the big stories that had explained what they were doing with those guns and how they were confronting their problems had changed, but the realities on the ground hadn't. So guerrillas became bandits. This happened in many places, in Southern Africa, in Central America. Police officers go into business for themselves as drug cartels, et cetera, et cetera. So the Cold War seeded this kind of sets of networks of underground armed actors who continued on after the ideologies had supposedly been retired or the ideological conflict had been retired. So now onto this stage, preset for crisis in much of the global South, comes climate change, expressing itself as extreme weather, sudden floods, long periods of drought, crop failure, the failure of fisheries. People respond to this frequently by cutting down trees to sell, so you have deforestation, further soil erosion exacerbated by the extreme precipitation. And I call this combination of the onset of extreme weather associated with climate change hitting the pre-existing crises of the legacy of Cold War militarism and the legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring, the catastrophic convergence, because the three forces interact together. And it's hard to unpack specifically in any one climate-driven conflict which of these is the primary cause or has a greater role in the situation. So, and not all of these climate-driven conflicts fit the model of this catastrophic convergence evenly or perfectly. And I'll just give you some case studies, and you can see how these dynamics play out differently and in different combinations in different places. So the clearest example of how this all works is in East Africa, in the Horn of Africa. I went to the Turkana region in northwest Kenya to look at how cattle raiding has become increasingly violent over the last decade and to 20 years. And cattle raiding is a traditional part of the society in much of the Horn of Africa, but in recent years it has become really quite violent. People might remember that about a year and a half ago, there was a cattle raid that left 600 people dead in South Sudan, just across the border from Kenya. And raiders from Kenya had gone into South Sudan and burnt down whole villages. So why is that? The book opens with a man named Ekuru Loriman who is lying dead at my feet. He had been killed the day before in a cattle raid. He was a Turkana pastoralist, and a neighboring group, the Pokot, had come down out of the Karasuk Hills and tried to steal his cattle, and there was a big gunfight. 6 people were killed. And I asked, why did this guy die? And you could say, well, at a certain level, it's because his neighbors killed him. But where did they get these guns? Why is everyone armed to the teeth in northern Kenya? The answer lies in the history of the Cold War. The West, we have cell phone issues here. Off is the button you're looking for. So the first wave of guns that enters Kenya, of AK-47s, happens with the fall of Idi Amin's regime in Uganda in 1978, 79, late 78, early 79. And Idi Amin had been given lots and lots of weapons. He was seen as potentially being sort of an ally of the West in the Cold War. He was really just a sort of kleptocratic maniac out there on his own. He built up an enormous army. He attacks Tanzania. He loses the war with Tanzania, and his army disintegrates, and Uganda momentarily collapses in 78, 79, and its armories are looted. And so tens of thousands of cheap weapons flow into Kenya, and that's when everyone starts carrying machine guns up there. The next big pulse of weapons into northern Kenya is the collapse of Somalia, which is still a failed state. And the story there is incredible, really. What happens is that there is a coup in Somalia in 1969, and a dictator named Said Barre comes to power. He declares himself a scientific socialist and says that scientific socialism is compatible with the pastoralist way of life and Islam. But more than anything, he is a Somali nationalist and an irredentist, and he wants to be the father of Greater Somalia. And the one Somali-speaking area that is not part of Somalia proper is in Ethiopia, in the Ogden region. And he immediately begins to foment a covert war in the Ogden region, organizing Somali-speaking groups there to resist the Ethiopian government, which at that point is the monarchy of Haile Selassie. Well, then in 1974, there's a coup d'etat in Ethiopia, and a group of young Marxist military officers take power. Said Barre, having declared himself a socialist, a communist of sorts, starts receiving assistance from the Cubans and the Soviet Union. And then so too do the Ethiopians. And it gets to the point in the late 70s where this covert war that Said Barre had begun escalates into a proper conventional war between these two nominally socialist states. And when Said Barre realizes that the Cubans and Soviets are supporting both his regime and the Ethiopians, and to their credit, particularly the Cubans, Fidel Castro had an intense interest in Africa, and he was desperately trying to get these two states not to fight each other and keeping them on side by giving them technical assistance and military support. Said Barre finds out that the Cubans and Soviets are supporting his enemy. He switched sides in the Cold War, and now he starts getting aid from the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. And really for the better part of the next decade, there are various on and off wars, but there's pretty much a continual state of war between Ethiopia and Somalia. And it ends with the disintegration of the Somalian army and the collapse of the state there. And again, the looting of all the arsenals and armories, and more weapons flow into the entire region, destabilizing all the neighboring states. And you can see in that example, I mean, neither Fidel Castro nor Jimmy Carter wanted to create a failed state, the first modern state. Regardless of what any of us think, both of them were motivated by their highest intentions, right? Fidel Castro was trying to support small post-colonial states and build a socialist revolution on a global scale. Jimmy Carter was trying to support free markets, which he genuinely believed brought political and cultural freedom and defend against a system that he saw as totalitarian, and both of them meant well, and the effort ended in a collapsed state that still hasn't been put back together again. And thus, people like Ekuru Lorman, who don't even own that many radios, they, in many cases have very little, do have access to cheap weapons, and they use them to survive. So what they're dealing with in this situation is also the onset of climate change, which in the Horn of Africa takes the form of increasingly frequent drought. It used to be that sort of people would say every 10 years or every 7 years there's a real bad drought year. Now it's every 2 or 3 years, and frequently they just merge together into one big drought. So when I was in the Turkana region, the trees were all dying. The Turkana women were cutting them down and turning them into charcoal because they were just genuinely dead. The cattle herds were dying, getting sick, and everyone was congregating around water holes and the few rivers there were, which only made people more vulnerable and brought conflicting groups closer in contact with each other. And in the pastoralist corridor of East Africa, everything is about cattle for the pastoralists. I mean, you can't become an adult if you don't engage in the cattle economy. You can't get married if you don't have cattle to pay the bride price, et cetera, et cetera. So to replenish the depleted herds damaged by climate change, young men pick up the gun and they go steal their neighbors' cattle. And thus you have this increase in hostility, increase in casualties and violence. But why is that the way they try to adapt to climate change? Why violence? I mean, it's not just because there are cheap guns around. I mean, there are cheap guns in other places, and people don't try and solve their problems by stealing their neighbor's property necessarily. The other component of it is that the state, due to economic restructuring, which began in the early 1990s, Kenya was one of the first states in Africa to undergo IMF-imposed structural adjustment, which meant that it had to cut subsidies for spending on social welfare and public infrastructure, privatize state assets, and open the economy to competition so that local businesses, which frequently couldn't compete with more developed and frequently sometimes subsidized foreign competition, folded. So you get rising unemployment and, most of all, a diminishment of the state's capacity to do anything. And the backstory on this is that Kenya faced a debt crisis, which was not entirely due to external forces. I mean, Kenyan elites, particularly Daniel Arap Moi, stole enormous amounts of money from the state. Daniel Arap Moi stole $2 billion of public money. So that's part of why the Kenyan economy was forced to undergo structural adjustment, because it couldn't balance its books, it couldn't pay for its operations, and so in exchange for survival loans from the international financial institutions, it had to accept these conditions of structural adjustment. So what that means in a place like the Turkana is that there's really very little the state can offer the pastoralists. So when people like Ekru Lorman want veterinary services to help them keep their ill cattle alive, or they want to bring in food, or even well drilling programs, not that mining ancient groundwater is the smartest thing to do to adapt to long-term climate change, but it's a short-term measure that you can imagine doing if you were an administrator in a poor developing country. Even that, the state really doesn't have the capacity to go out and drill wells to help the pastoralists ride out the hard times. So the state has nothing for these people because of structural adjustment, because neoliberal economic orthodoxy holds that the state is generally just a force that encumbers the economy, and that if you can remove it as much as possible, reduce it to something that only protects property rights, then capitalism will blossom. When in fact the actual history of capitalism shows, from the development of the United States to the development of the British Empire to the rise of India and China, that in fact successful capitalist development frequently involves lots of state involvement. South Korea is another good example of that. Rapid industrialization and rising standard of living, not because the state got out of the way, but because the state had a program of planning that involved subsidies and it wasn't a socialist model of development, but it wasn't an anti-state model of development. And neoliberalism is, deeply anti-statist ideology. And it becomes the dominant paradigm in economic planning beginning in the late 70s in response to an international profit crisis that causes elites, political elites and planners in the West who had embraced Keynesianism, who had seen the legitimacy of the state playing a role in capitalist development, causes them to move away from that and embrace the Reagan-Thatcher worldview of reducing the state to, as Grover Norquist likes to say, the size where you can drown it in the bathtub. But when you are out on the front lines and you need some help, that kind of state is of no use to you. And so you turn to the gun. So that's how Ekru Lorman died, essentially. This combination of the onset of climate change, the legacy of the Cold War, which meant there's just tons of guns around, and the erosion of the Kenyan state's capacity to do anything for its people. That's, in a way, the sort of ideal type of this catastrophic convergence. You can see sort of equal parts legacy of Cold War, neoliberal economic restructuring, onset of climate change. But in other places, the balance is quite different. So in Afghanistan, for example, there really isn't much of a history of economic restructuring. There, the cause of the collapse and the crisis really has to do with the Cold War. It has to do with the coup d'etat, actually a series of coup d'etats, which interestingly are in fact rooted in environmental crisis. So there was a very severe 3-year drought in Afghanistan in the late 60s, early 70s. Possibly 2 million people starved to death during this. And it was that triggered Daoud Khan, who was a relative of the king's, to overthrow Zahir Shah, who was the king. He was off in Italy on vacation, and his cousin, Daoud Khan, had a relatively bloodless coup and abolished the monarchy, sets up a Republican presidential republic with himself at the head, and he brings in both the communists and the Islamists, who are sort of like the nascent political parties gestating in the Kabul University, and he plays them off against each other and starts repressing the Islamists who flee to Pakistan, some of them, where they are immediately given safe haven by the government in Pakistan because there's a long-running dispute over the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then there is, in 1978, a communist coup coming out of the military. And after 1 year of that government mismanaging the economy, unfortunately, and fighting among itself, because the Afghan Communist Party was divided into 2 factions that hated each other bitterly. It got to the point where there were shootouts in the National Palace. And there were a lot of Soviet advisors and technocrats there already. Daoud Khan had, in fact, brought them in. And from the early 50s on, Afghanistan was one of the top 4 recipients of Soviet aid, even when it was a constitutional monarchy. And this was because the Soviet Union felt that the key to stability in Central Asia was a stable Afghanistan. So the Soviet position on Afghanistan was actually very non-ideological. Just like, whoever is going to keep the lights on and keep the peace needs support. Because if there is chaos and violence in Afghanistan, it's going to flow into Central Asia. So the PDPA, the Afghan Communist government, disintegrates throughout 1979. And at the end of 1979, after they had actually been asking the Soviets to come in and help them more, there is actually an invasion. And they kill the extremist President Amin, and they replace him with Karmal, a more moderate president. And there begins, on the other side of the border in Pakistan, this buildup of support for the Mujahideen. The US starts channeling money through the Pakistani intelligence, and the Saudis match the US, and you have, throughout the 1980s, this infamous war that I'm sure many of you have read about which ends with the defeat of the Soviet occupation there, and a few years after the Soviets leave, the collapse of the sort of post-socialist nationalist government of Najibullah. And out of that chaos, the collapse of Najibullah's regime, the Mujahideen, the 7 parties of the Mujahideen, who had been supported by the US and Pakistan, come into Kabul. They can't work out a power arrangement, a power sharing agreement, and after a few months of their rule, the city falls into civil war in which half of the city is destroyed and tens of thousands of people are killed. And that's the cause of the collapse of Afghanistan. It's not structural adjustment. It's clearly a product of the Cold War. It's clearly a product of the superpowers fighting each other, in this case, one of them being directly involved, fighting each other through these proxy wars and leaving, as a result, unintended, frequently very fragile, if not failed states. And there's really, it's not the IMF forcing privatization or whatever. In other places, which I'll get to later, it's the exact opposite. There's very little sort of history of the Cold War, and it's really about structural adjustment. That would be the story of Latin America. But speaking of Central Asia, because I was asked to give special attention to Central Asia, an example of how this catastrophic convergence plays out in cities is apparent in Kyrgyzstan. So just as it is easy to see how climate affects economy and therefore violence in the countryside, it's hard to see how climate plays a role in politics in cities. But in Kyrgyzstan, you can see it. So in 2010, April and May of 2010, you might recall that there was violence between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan. And the capital Bishkek went up in flames. One government fell, another government came in. It requested that the Russians send in troops. They wisely declined to do that. 350 people were killed, thousands were displaced, and there is a sort of, a fragile piece there now. So the underlying story of that conflict runs as follows. Kyrgyzstan is heavily dependent on hydroelectric electricity. It gets almost 90% of its electricity from hydropower. Particularly, power produced at this one large dam, the Toktala Dam, which is a Soviet-built dam with the Toktala Reservoir behind it. The same drought that has been damaging Afghanistan for the last 10 years had led to the water levels in the Toktala Dam dropping by 50%. It got so bad that the government had to ration power. And once you start rationing power, then industry, in turn, has to ration work. And there was a very negative knock-on effect. Unemployment increased. That means that small businesses, in turn, have less customers. They lay people off. And the economy was in a very bad state. At the same time, the winter of 2007 was the driest winter on record. 2008, extremely cold. Cattle herds are dying on the hills. Pipes are bursting in the old Soviet tower blocks. Senior citizens literally starving freezing to death. And in response to this crisis, the government at the time decides that it's going to re-engage with a failed privatization effort that had begun in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but had caused so much social dislocation that it had to be stopped in around 2000. So the government is going to revive the economy by selling off more state assets, and it's going to start with the utilities, and to make the dams and the power lines, the whole electrical system more attractive to investors, it raises tariffs by 100% with a promise to raise them by another 100%, possibly 200%. And it is in response to all of that that in April 2010, people hit the streets protesting the economic crisis. And this cry for attention and proper economic policy by normal people in the capital city unfortunately quickly devolves into an interethnic conflict as it is hijacked by groups of lumpenized young men, guys who have been unable to go to school, who have been unable to get jobs, and have spent their formative years basically drinking and hanging out in casinos with their ethnic kin, their Uzbek or their Kyrgyz comrades. And so these elements essentially hijack the crisis, and what is an economic protest devolves into intercommunal violence in which the Uzbeks are getting the worst of it, and they're seen as sort of the outsiders who have come in and displaced the Kyrgyz. But in this case, the Kyrgyz had the upper hand, and they were burning out whole Uzbek neighborhoods. Thousands of Uzbeks fled to the Uzbekistan border. They were blocked by the Uzbekistan army. And you can see then that underneath this ethnic conflict is an economic crisis, lack of work, lack of public investment, rising cost of living. And underneath that is an environmental crisis that is linked to climate change. The fact that the main source of electricity on which the entire economy essentially runs is in collapse because the water levels in the dam are at 50%, and you simply can't produce enough electricity to keep the economy going. And in that example, you can see how also that crises in the countryside can show up as environmental, climate-driven crises in the countryside can show up as political crises in the cities and not appear to be linked to the environment. Another example of those sorts of telekinetics, if you will, would be the Arab Spring to some extent. Not to reduce that to climate change at all, but one of the main things people were demanding in Tahrir Square and in Tunisia, where it first began, was for more subsidies for food or to lower the price of food. What was going on was that grain prices between June 2010, June 2011 had almost doubled on world markets. Corn had gone up by, I think it was 91%, grain 83%. And part of what was driving this was extreme weather in the core grain-producing areas of the world. There had been drought and flooding in the upper Midwest and Canada. There had been drought and flooding in Australia, as there has been this year again. And there had been very, very severe drought in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. It's called the Black Sea Drought. You remember in 2010, the headlines about Moscow being clogged with smoke from forest fires, very, very intense drought all across Russia, decimated the wheat harvest. And amidst this, Glencore, a major commodities trader, urged publicly, wrote something in the Financial Times, a letter to the Financial Times encouraging this, as I recall, that Russia ban wheat exports, which Russia did do for fear of rising prices, food prices in Russia. And Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine are some of the largest wheat exporters in the world. Well, who's one of the largest wheat importers in the world? Egypt. And that year, food inflation was running at between 20 and 40%. I wrote, I think, one of the first articles about this, and I found that food inflation was running at about 20%. Later, The Economist said it was running at 38%. Whatever the case, food inflation was intense that year. The average Egyptian spends 40% of their income on food. And so you have to ask, why did things jump off the way they did in 2011? Why not 5 years before, 5 years later? I mean, Egyptians had been living under this kleptocracy of Mubarak's for 30 years. I mean, why then? I think something had to do with the fact that it was the second major food price spike in 5 years. And that food price spike, though there's a role for speculators in all of that, it was in large part driven by the damage of extreme weather in these core grain-producing areas. And again, you could say, well, you can't say that any weather event is caused by climate change. But it fits the pattern that has been predicted for at least 30 years, and it is now playing out. And I mean, what the major climate models predict is that by the end of this century, a third of the planet could be desert. So that's just an example of how, when thinking about climate change as a political force, we have to think historically and in a broad geographic context, because cause and effect don't generally line up neatly in one country or one place. Then you have to look at the connections of stuff like grain markets, et cetera, or the migration of people from one place to another. Another example of how climate change is driving rebellion that has different causes would be in India, too. World's largest democracy, but it also has one of the oldest civil wars in the world, which began in 1967. In Naxalbari, there was a massacre of some activists, and then out of that grew a Maoist guerrilla movement called the Naxalites, which is shorthand for a group of parties that have united and split and reunited. And what's interesting is that this war, for most of the last 40 years, was contained up in West Bengal, in sort of the northeastern corner of India. But in the last 10, 15 years, it has moved down the eastern side of India, down along the eastern Ghats, and quite far south. And so I went to northern Andhra Pradesh, to a region that had had a lot of Naxalite violence, to see if there was a climate connection, and sure enough there is. And what you see is that what they call the red corridor, which is where the Naxalite activity shows up, is also almost perfectly matches the drought corridor. And this region of India has been suffering increased drought and all that goes with that in the same time period that the Naxalites have been advancing. And you can almost map district by district how the drought will move, and then the Naxalites move in. So, and there's also, of course, the Naxalites sometimes get pushed out. It's not, not always so neat. But, so I was wondering, what is the actual connection? How does this work? And it works through the credit markets, interestingly enough, and through genetically modified crops. So in Andhra Pradesh, what happens is in districts where there's drought, crops fail, farmers have to borrow money. Due to economic liberalization, there is less subsidy from the state. There are fewer state-owned banks that are willing to give low-interest loans. There are fewer agricultural extension programs, so farmers turn to the moneylenders. The moneylenders won't lend money for food crops for fear that if the food crop is collateral, the farmer in an emergency might steal it. So they will only advance money for seeds, for cotton seeds, and fertilizer and pesticides for cotton, because there's only one thing you can do with cotton, which is sell it and turn it into money, and that's what the money lenders want. They don't want land for a variety of reasons. One, because they're just sort of not in the business of owning land, and also because there's such an environmental crisis in that region. They don't really want to be holding this land, which is going into crisis. So what that means for the farmers is that they go deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. So that if you have a bad year, the only solution is to borrow more and hope that the next year will be better. And eventually, farmers get to the point where many of them are killing themselves. Across India, 200,000 farmers have committed suicide because they can't make it anymore. In Andhra Pradesh, about 2,000 farmers had committed suicide, frequently by drinking the pesticides intended for their genetically modified cotton, which sounds like an unbelievably painful way to die, but you have to admit has some sort of just horrific poetic statement embedded in it. So you can imagine how if you are on the verge of drinking pesticides to kill yourself and the Naxalites come along, it would be pretty appealing. And the Naxalites have two stories, right? They say, well, we've got a short-term and a long-term solution to your problem. The long-term solution is we're going to take state power and we're going to have a Maoist-style socialist people's state here in India. Now, whether or not you buy that as an Indian farmer, if you're on the verge of suicide, you'd probably be pretty attracted to their more short-term solution, which is that And the next time the moneylender shows up in the village, we're going to stop his car, drag him out, and kill him. And when the cops come to investigate, we're going to ambush them. And so people support the Naxalites because the Naxalites show up and take direct action against the people who are driving the farmers to suicide. So, now these are all examples from the global south, and I think I'll give you a few sort of examples from Latin America, and then talk about also how climate change is driving violence in the global north in a very different fashion. But how even in the policies of the US and Europe, you can see that there's a climatological element going on. But in Latin America, climate violence is very much a story of the countryside and the city, and it's about flows of people into cities and what the governments in those cities can or cannot provide people. So I looked at the case of Rio, where there is, at times, something like a state of war between the police and these major gangs in the favelas. The main gang in Rio is the Comando Vermelho, which is the Red Command, which, as its name would indicate, has its origins as an urban guerrilla movement from the 1970s. They were incarcerated, they try to organize prisoners, and this Marxist revolutionary guerrilla movement becomes a basically paramilitary, depoliticized or apolitical gang involved in the cocaine and drug trade. And they maintain the weaponry and the organization of a guerrilla army, but have none of the ideology. And there's a similar situation in São Paulo. And so when the police go into the favelas, they go in paramilitary fashion. They carry machine guns, they have helicopter support, and they have major firefights with these gangs. So I was wondering, is there a climatological element to this? And there's a small climatological element, which is that the main place from which people come when they settle in Rio is the Northeast, which has been traditionally an arid area, but is increasingly getting hammered by climate change. And so people can't make it on the land due to extreme weather, before Lula's government came in, really, due to also lack of any kind of support from the state, though there's much more of that now. They end up in these favelas. There's not sufficient work, there's not much education, but there are these para-states, these gangs that control the favelas that can provide particularly young men with work as lookouts and soldiers. And so there you can see part of the resources, the human resources of this conflict are people driven off the land increasingly by extreme weather. Similarly in Mexico, I went to Juarez, to the height of the violence there, and was wondering how many people in Juarez had weather in the story of why they left the land. And sure enough, it's not that hard to find. Found a guy who was sitting on the south bank of the Rio Grande, looking north into the US, and he explained how he had been a fisherman in Michoacan, and that an El Nino event in 1998 had caused a red tide of algae bloom that drove away the fish, and then the fish never really came back. The water was increasingly warm. There was also a lot of runoff due to careless development on the land. And what he was describing were the effects of NAFTA in many ways. Okay, time is going. So he, and again, because of privatization of all of the old supports for fishermen, he had to fall back on private credit markets. He eventually lost his boat. He moves north, he goes to the US. He's kicked out of the US after working as a roofer there. I meet him, he's sitting, looking into the US saying, my boss in the US, I called him, he said I can have my old job back if I can get into the US, but the border's so militarized, I need $3,000 for a coyote to get across the border. And the only way I can get $3,000 here in Juarez is to get involved in the drug trade, and hopefully save $3,000 so I can get back into the US to get my old job back. And similarly, Tarahumara Indians who were living in Juarez explaining how their crops were failing in the Sierra Maestra due to drought, and deforestation, and so they moved to Juarez for work, and how their youth are all getting caught up in the violence of the drug trade. And on the north side of the border, you see there a response that is about many other things, but increasingly, you know, the discourse, the right-wing xenophobic discourse in the Southwest that has produced stuff like SB 1070, the law in Arizona that obliged the police to stop anyone they thought might be an undocumented migrant, and you know, the constituency that supports border militarization in all its forms. Increasingly, there's an element of that scene that explains things in environmental terms. A famous case of this is this woman, Brenda Walker, who describes herself as an environmentalist. And she says, look, you know, there's an environmental crisis, there's not enough to go around, so the solution is militarize the border and increase police power here in the US. And that's a minority element in what's driving border militarization, but you can imagine how in the future that will become a more important part of what motivates border militarization. And as it is now, half of the border is walled off with metal fencing. The Border Patrol has what would be one of the largest air forces in the world. The US military is routinely on patrol on the border, supporting the Border Patrol. On any given night, there are about 30,000 people in detention for immigration violations in detention centers generally run by private businesses, unlike prisons, which might, you know, a lot of people think that the prison buildup in the US was driven by private prisons. There's actually, they're not that big a part of state and federal prison management, but in terms of immigration management, they dominate these facilities, and the conditions are horrendous. So there you see an incipient type of state repression that is increasingly linked to climate change. And then also in the analysis and planning of the US military and European militaries. They have done studies on what to expect in the future. Some of these are secret, some of these are published, and they think that climate change is going to be very disruptive, and they see not so much a conflict between states over resources, but an increase of conflict within states along ethnic, class, and religious lines. And the US military in particular feels that it is going to be called in to fight counterinsurgencies and do other types of operations, and they're planning for essentially an open-ended counterinsurgency campaign or anti-terror campaign on a global scale forever. And though it's not discussed by the political class and it's not discussed that publicly by the military, there's definitely a set of planners who see the future mission of the US military as about containing the crisis, the multiple crises that are being caused and will be caused by climate change. And you know, the Arab Spring is an example of that the response to that is, in many cases, been what? By the US military. And it's not described as a climate war, it's not described as a response to climate violence, but that's an element in what's going on. That's part of why the US has, you know, runs drone flights over Yemen, part of why the French invaded Mali is because that region is disintegrating under the pressures of climate change in the region and what climate change does to the prices of imports. So anyway, I've gone to the end-ish of my time, and I should open up for questions. So on that note, let me take some of your questions.
My name is Jason Welsh. I'm a retiree living south of town in Farrington Village. When you mentioned Afghanistan and the time when there were two communist parties, two factions of the Communist Party battling each other, was that differentiation about their different ideology, or was it largely tribally based?
It was mostly ideological. I mean, there was maybe a little bit of a tribal element, ethnic element between Pashtuns and Tajiks, but they were all mostly Pashtun. The elites in Afghanistan have traditionally been Pashtun. So it wasn't as tribal as one would think. It was much more ideological, to the extent that I've read about it. I mean, the ethnic stuff doesn't come up that much.
I'm Jackson Kennedy, and about what percentage of the global uprisings have an identifiable climate factor?
I'm not sure, and the question was, what percentage have had an identifiable climate factor? I'm not sure that anyone has done the work to actually measure it in those terms so precisely as to give a percentage. And I mean, what I've done is a more interpretive look at it, and I didn't also try and measure all these conflicts and come up with a number. But I would say that, generally, there are other primary factors that are more obvious and probably more important in the immediate term, but that underneath them, climate change is an important subsidiary factor. And as we go forward, if we don't take proper steps to adapt to climate change in ways other than warfare, and if we don't mitigate the problem immediately, starting immediately, which is to say if we don't cut greenhouse gas emissions, then I think it will be more apparent the role that climate change plays in these conflicts, and that it will, in many cases, become the driving factor. But we're not at that point yet. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sarah Nelson. I live down here. I guess, so when I try to think to myself about the long-term, a simplified version of the long-term global effects of climate change, people like Howard Odom have been helpful to me, and David Holmgren has a book about future scenarios and how climate change sort of ends up being causing an overall reduction on every scale of the resources available just to conduct daily business. And it seems like a lot of these conflicts come out of that type of just there's not enough, the state doesn't have the ability to manage these things. Individual people, their livelihood is gone. And so I was wondering, I guess did you see any, and I don't see really how just how this can be confronted, even with even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases right now, it seems to me like this is going to intensify for a while. And I guess I was wondering if you saw any positive examples in any of your travels of places where people had organized in ways to make do without these infrastructures that just can't function anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't see any examples of people making do without the infrastructure, but I mean there are examples of extreme weather causing social disruptions that are not necessarily bad and lead to violence. An example would be in Pakistan. I mean, the floods there have probably also exacerbated the 3 civil wars that are going on. But one thing they did was they essentially liberated a bunch of peasants who were in essentially debt slavery. And so after the 2011 floods, I went and did an article for The Nation about this, and I was interviewing these camps of IDPs, internally displaced people who are haughty peasants, and saying, oh, well, you must really be, wanting to get home to the farm. This is awful living in this refugee camp, huh? And time and again, they're saying, actually, no, we don't want to go back to the farm. I'm like, why not? Because it belongs to a landlord who has armed thugs. He keeps us all in debt. He illegally passes the debts of the parents down to children. He has a private jail. It's impossible to escape. We got out of there. And then they were organizing and refusing to disband. And so not to romanticize what's going on at all, but it is an example of people being, having their old livelihood destroyed, but in the process being liberated from a kind of feudal political control that they otherwise were not able to escape. And once they were free of the direct control of the landlords, and these landlords would come back with like armed thugs to these refugee camps and try and get families to come back with them, try and kidnap people essentially. And there were conflicts of the community banding together and resisting this. And and then so these camps would form just basic sort of survival committees that then sort of start morphing into social movements. So that's not a story that's by any means played out yet, but that's an example of how you can see that there are sometimes positive outcomes to these disruptions, that old, truly oppressive, ossified feudal political structures couldn't be resisted by these peasants until nature kind of pushed them out of the way. I'm sure there are other examples, but I didn't find them other than that one.
Have you done any research on, or do you have any opinion on weather modification?
No, I don't. I haven't done. This is the idea that the government is controlling the weather. I mean, I have not looked into it. I think that the main issue is the obvious problem of anthropogenic climate change caused by 150 years of burning increasingly large amounts of fossil fuels. That's the real issue that we face in regards to the weather changing. One thing I didn't say, while you're searching for another question there, one thing I didn't say because I'm concerned about the time is, in the end of the book, I do offer what I think is some good news, which is that, it's not impossible to deal with this problem. The language around climate change is that of mitigation and adaptation. We have to mitigate the problem by moving off of fossil fuels onto clean energy, and we have to adapt to the problem socially and physically. We have to retreat from the sea. If the seas are going to rise, which they are definitely going to rise by at least 3 feet by the end of the century, say most of the best climate models, that has to be dealt with. There has to be planning for that. In Vietnam, there's a discussion about how that should be dealt with, and there's a group of people who are lobbying really hard and might get somewhere to create a bioshield, sort of just slowly retreat over the next 60 years, a kilometer or two back from the coast to allow a natural break to save the Mekong Delta, which is the heart of the Vietnamese economy, and the whole thing is essentially like 1 meter above sea level. That's an example of physical adaptation. But this is not impossible, these adaptation and mitigation. So the United States, the largest economy in the world until recently, until China surpassed us, the largest single greenhouse gas emitter, we actually have the laws we need to deal with this. We have the technology and we have the money. And here's what it is. The Clean Air Act, which was created in 1970 under Richard Nixon and then amended in 1990 or 91 under Daddy Bush, is a very, very robust law. When Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol, but then the Senate refused to ratify it, Massachusetts and some other states and environmental groups sued the federal government saying, you have to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act because they are harmful to human health and therefore they qualify as pollution under the definition of this law. That case took 10 years to resolve, and the environmentalists and the states won, and it's Massachusetts versus EPA. And the Supreme Court said in 2007, yes, in fact, the EPA has the obligation to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Bush did nothing about this. He ignored it. Obama said he was going to take it seriously. He came in, he put Lisa Jackson at the head of the EPA, and then put her on a tight leash and really held the EPA back from doing what it could do. But the implications of Massachusetts EPA are potentially very profound. What it means is that we have enabling legislation to impose a carbon tax on the economy. It would mean that you'd be free to burn coal, but if the EPA set the emissions levels low enough, then most coal plants, or natural gas plants for that matter, would be in violation and would have to pay hefty fines. And that would raise the cost of energy from fossil fuels. That would in turn make investing in clean energy much more attractive. Currently, the private sector is sitting on $2 trillion worth of uninvested money. This is according to the Federal Reserve. More uninvested capital than at any time since 1956. This is not money that's paid out as stock dividends. This is not money that's paid as bonuses to CEOs. This is money that is retained by companies for investments and parked in short-term, low-yield public debt usually. And they're waiting for cues like, what's the next big thing? How should we invest this? If the EPA really started issuing rules pursuant to the Clean Air Act that imposed this kind of carbon tax, that would be a cue that people should not invest in natural gas. They should not invest in gasoline-driven vehicles, but invest in wind farms, solar farms, electric vehicles, conservation, energy conservation efforts, etc. Another tool that is readily at hand is government procurement. The right makes a big deal about how outsized government is, and progressives and the left generally don't even discuss the topic, either because liberals are kind of afraid of trying to set the agenda, and further to the left there's such sort of anti-statism, there's kind of a libertarian anarchist element in much of the American left that really despises the state and therefore unfortunately doesn't think creatively about it. The fact of the matter is, yes, government is actually a big part of the US economy. It's about generally 1/3 of the US economy, depending on the year you look at it. When I analyzed it in 2009, it was 38% of GDP was federal and state activity, economic activity. And this is not double counting money that the feds give to the states. Okay, so that's not all money for investment in energy, but the government is a huge consumer of energy. The federal government is the single largest consumer of energy in the US economy. It has a fleet of 450,000 generally very large, wasteful office buildings. They could all be retrofitted. That would build a market for those kinds of services. It has large numbers of vehicles. The post office alone has 140,000 vehicles that almost, all of which travel less than 18 miles a day and park in the same place every night. There's no reason they can't be electrified. The Government Services Agency, the General Services Agency, which is like the federal government's janitor, has a similarly large fleet, it's even bigger, of vehicles. Some of them have to drive long distances, but a lot of them could be electrified. If the federal government, and then states in imitation of it, committed itself to purchasing as much clean power as possible and purchasing clean vehicles and building out recharging infrastructure for those vehicles, that would do a number of things. One, it would reduce the carbon footprint of the federal government and state governments, which would be good in and of itself, but it would have a knock-on effect in that it would create economies of scale for the clean tech sector, which currently has a very hard time competing against the heavily subsidized dirty tech sector. So I interviewed the only electric vehicle manufacturer in the United States. And the CEO said, if we could get orders of like 50 or 100 rather than 5 vehicles at a time, in some cases we could lower our costs by up to 25, maybe even 30%. And if that could be achieved, then buying an electric delivery truck would be cost competitive with buying a gasoline delivery truck. And the fuel would be cheaper. And if that happened, then you could imagine Budweiser and Frito-Lay and whoever else not buying diesel and gasoline trucks, but buying electric trucks because they're just cheaper to operate and cheaper to buy. So, and you could go on and on and on with examples of what the knock-on effects of a kind of green government purchasing could do. It would build a guaranteed market for clean energy, which would then encourage people to invest in appropriate technologies and building out wind and solar farms, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that, even in this country where the political process seems to be totally sclerotic, we have already the enabling legislation we need. We have lots of money, both public and private, and we have the technology. It's not like we haven't invented commercial scale solar power or wind power or electric vehicles. All of that stuff exists, and it's just a matter of scaling it up. That's not the end of the story, but that would be a logical first step. And then we could really start, retiring coal and gas power plants and moving towards clean energy. That in and of itself, I should say, would not solve the environmental problem. But what it would do is it would start mitigating the problem of climate change. And even if we solve the problem of climate change, that's not the same as solving the broader environmental crisis of, the increasing toxicity of the environment, overfishing, soil loss, deforestation. There's numerous planetary boundaries that we have shot beyond. But the thing about climate change is that it is the most pressing problem. So solving it is essentially buying time to deal with other problems that are not on such a compressed time frame. So I think that's important, to not lose sight of the other aspects of the environmental crisis, but at the same time not just see climate changes like overfishing or like deforestation. No, it is the primary problem that has to be dealt with so as to buy time to deal with the other problems. And it's not impossible to do that.
I think we'll stop there and join me in thanking Christian. The questions can continue. We'll have a reception and the book signing. And then, of course, everyone's welcome to join us for tomorrow's day at the Keynote Center for day 2 of the symposium. So thank you for coming this evening.
Thanks a lot.